Thanks, Bill. Thanks. Thanks so much, everybody. I'm really honored to be with you tonight and a little anxious. These are hard issues to talk about. We've been talking about them for a long time, but they're hard every time. And Bill mentioned the events that we're getting ready to have on April 1st through the 4th. You folks are actually kicking them off on April 1st with a discussion about some of the issues that we're talking about tonight. Then on April 2nd, we will begin following the course of events by a series of anniversaries when Richmond stood at the center of world history. On the 2nd, there will be a lecture by Nelson Langford at the church where Jefferson Davis received word that the Confederacy was leaving the vicinity. Followed that evening by Enlighten Richmond will illuminate the parts of the burned district, and we'll have historical interpreters from all different kinds of roles, from a young woman on the cusp of freedom to a refugee white woman who had fled here to be safe only to watch the city burn, to a Confederate soldier who's been left, to United States colored troops who are on the verge of coming into the city. The next day we will have on the evening a celebration of the end of slavery in Shockoe Bottom. The next day, Saturday, we have the state capitol and the capitol grounds for the Future of Richmond's Past, an alliance of 23 different organizations embracing the full range of those who have care for this community's history, to try to give you as full an account as you possibly can of all the things that were happening here. It's going to be a remarkable series of events. Governor McAuliffe will address us from the steps of the Capitol. And as far as we can remember, this is the first time that the Capitol's been used for such a thing. And that Capitol, of course, everything from the first neoclassical building in America to the Capitol of the Confederacy. And now we're going to see it as the Capitol where Richmond and the country celebrate the end of slavery. So when Randy and Bill asked me to join you tonight and talk about these issues, I was happy to do so, of course. Randy is a great ally in this work. And over the last 5 years, when I've spoken about this, just about every time I've been asked, I've found that religious congregations are especially honest with themselves and especially thoughtful about the meanings of the history whose consequences we live with every day. Much of the leadership of our community struggles with that history for the last 20 years, have been led by people from many religious faiths and religious communities from which they have drawn the strength to confront what others would prefer to avoid. Clearly, faith, freedom, and forgiveness are deeply related. So this evening I want to puzzle with you and perhaps pain you about the role of the evangelical Protestant Christian church in slavery, war, and their aftermath. I'd like to tell you two Richmond stories, beginning with a predecessor of mine in the presidency of the University of Richmond, Robert Ryland. Ryland tried to behave in a generous Christian way with the African American people among whom he lived all his life, even as he presided over what he recognized was a compromised form of the church. He faced skepticism and criticism from all sides and experienced considerable doubt, but he pressed on. And we're not exactly sure what to do with such a person. To live as a white person in the slave South was to be unavoidably implicated in slavery, to benefit from slavery. And Ryland himself owned 7 enslaved people. To give all you had to the Confederacy was to be implicated in its cause of creating an autonomous slaveholding nation, one self-consciously and proudly Christian, as profoundly contradictory as that seems to us. And Ryland did that too. But Ryland did more than these things. He also worked alongside his fellow black Christians, trying to sustain the marrow of his faith and of theirs, even as he paid Caesar what Caesar demanded. His story holds up a mirror to his own time and to ours. How will we, whatever our background and whatever our skin color, be judged by those who follow us? Are we also complicit in the great inequality and injustice all around us? Are we too giving away too much by aligning ourselves with the institutions and values of our own time and place? I am not profound on these issues. I am neither a theologian nor a philosopher. I tell stories. And sometimes stories can help us see ourselves more clearly. But for the stories to be useful, they need to refrain too quickly from judging people of the past. Judging them is easy. They are dead, cannot fight back. And for the same reason, winning an argument with them is kind of an empty victory. Rather, it's better to try to understand why they did the things they did. The decisions they should have made seem obvious to us in retrospect, and yet they, at least as human as we are, did not. Now, far more than most people, the Reverend Robert Ryland embodied the struggles of his time and place. Let me sketch you his history for you. He was born in King and Queen County in 1805. His father offered each of his sons a farm, but Robert chose to take his inheritance and an education instead. He went to the Columbian College, which is now what we think of as George Washington University. He was one of the very first graduates, 1826. He became a pastor in Lynchburg for his first 5 years out of college. Married in 1830, he was on the rise. He was doing all the right things. To be an educated pastor back then, especially a Baptist, was not a common thing. Let the record show on page 3, he made a Baptist joke, and the Presbyterians, among whom I've married, laughed appreciatively. Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831 and the crackdown that followed on African American preachers and churches and gatherings and reading suddenly changed the Virginia Robert Ryland had grown up in. For decades, black preaching had been tolerated, even encouraged, often admired. White people would go listen to black preachers, admiring the way that they brought the gospel to life. Now, the state of Virginia prohibited it. And Ryland argued in the Religious Herald that white Christians had the right responsibility to minister to the enslaved people around them. With others, he called for a mission to the slaves, an active crusade to evangelize among men, women, and children in slavery, despite the long simmering fear and contempt unleashed in the wake of the Turner Rebellion. This is something that happens across the South, that white Christians say we need to have a mission to the enslaved people among us just as we do internationally. And African Americans, free and enslaved, clearly found in the church a strength in a world that was arrayed against them. The number of black evangelical Christians in Virginia doubled between 1830 and 1850. They recruited and converted each other, but white ministers mattered as well. Now, white ministers had to strike a deal if they were to work among their free and enslaved black neighbors. To make the argument that white Christians had a responsibility to reach out to black Christians, Ryland, like other white Southern evangelicals, had to reassure other whites that this was not abolition in disguise. So in that same 1835 article in the Religious Herald, in which he argued for a mission to the slaves, the young Ryland pointed out that the Bible implicitly sanctions slavery in the command that masters give to servants their due. You could have heard this from every pulpit in the South for generations, that the Bible does not condemn slavery. We are only doing what our ancestors in the Old Testament did. But even as Ryland made that argument, even as he insisted that the argument in favor of ministering to the enslaved was, as he said, manly and just, and his views sound and liberal, and the conclusion logical, he admitted, quote, "I do not wish to be considered an advocate for slavery, though I appear to be in the above remarks. I feel the perplexity of the subject." Now, why would he say this? Only 3 years earlier, and this is hard for us to imagine, here in Richmond, a convention debated whether or not slavery should be outlawed in Virginia. And many people stood up in the early 1830s and said, yes, it's a terrible burden, not only to the black people, but to the white. But then they voted not to act, and they said that we should never talk about this again. Now that's happening at the same time that abolitionism is rising in the North, 1830s, and it's immediately after Nat Turner's rebellion. And so they're thinking what many white people dreamed of more than anything was to end slavery and to send the enslaved people somewhere else. But they did not, and after that, you were not supposed to ever raise your voice as a white person to express any doubt about slavery. And for the next 25 years, they did not. You will read the newspapers and letters and diaries of the white South and find that they had banished these thoughts from at least their lips, if not their hearts. But in the meantime, even as Ryland banished the perplexity of the subject from his mind, he took on a new job. He created the institution that would become the University of Richmond. And under his leadership, the institution grew from a seminary with one teacher to a college which at the beginning of the Civil War had an endowment of $100,000, a faculty of 6 professors and 1 tutor, and an average attendance of about 120 students. And you can still see where that was down on Grace Street. They still have the columns down there in the middle of VCU land, the remnants of Richmond College that's there. And you drive through there and you'll see some names you recognize. There's a Ryland and there's a Boatwright down there, and I like to think about them holding up the torch of the University of Richmond downtown. Now, to build this institution from nothing into a healthy college with an impressive building not far from the Capitol, Ryland had to stay on the good side of Baptists across the Commonwealth. Indeed, he relentlessly implored Baptist congregations to contribute to Richmond College, to create an educated Baptist ministry. So Ryland had important institutional responsibilities throughout the 1840s and 1850s, serving Baptist congregations across the state at a time of great growth and also of great sectional conflict. It would have been wise for him, perhaps, to have kept his head down, but he didn't. Instead, he became part of another bold new experiment. Now, as early as the 1820s, black Richmonders petitioned for their own separate church. The young city was growing rapidly, and African Americans, enslaved and free, made up about half the population. About 1 in 5 were free blacks and ran their own businesses and families and households. They wanted to run their own churches as well. They were rebuffed, however, until the First Baptist Church of Richmond took the lead. By 1838, that flourishing church had become too small for its congregation, and its architecture was, as Ryland put it, far behind the times. The mixed character of the audience, composed of white and colored people, was thought to militate seriously against the progress of the church. The colored element was so large that only a small part of it could be furnished with sittings. Its spiritual oversight was still more difficult to be managed. A large proportion of this class, being slaves, could not be reached and disciplined except by persons of their own color. Few of them could attend the church meetings, and the instructions of the pulpit could not always be adapted, especially to their wants. But First Baptist didn't know if it could afford to build a separate new building for its colored members, as they called them, or even if it was legal to do so, given the strictures of Virginia law. Now, of course, knowing the history of segregation that followed the Civil War, it seems strange to think that the Commonwealth would worry about creating a separate building for black Richmonders. But many whites thought that black Christians should not be permitted to worship beyond the sight of white people. Quote, and if the measure were strictly legal, Ryland wondered, would public sentiment on some subjects far more potent and more jealous than law quietly acquiesce the arrangement? Would white people, in other words, especially those without devotion to the church or even antagonistic to it, tolerate black congregations with any kind of autonomy? After Nat Turner had held up the Bible and seen the evidence that it was a time for the last to be first, would black people ever be trusted by white people to interpret God's Word for themselves? First Baptist and Robert Ryland went ahead with a large audience of skeptics of both races watching warily. And the arrangement they came up with was also surprising. The white church would build the building and deed it to the black members when they had raised half the cost of the structure. That meant that black Richmonders were responsible for $4,500, which is nearly $100,000 today. They did raise that amount, and the sacrifice that entailed is hard for us to imagine when people were being paid, when they were paid at all, in pennies and nickels and dimes. The free black members had more to contribute than the enslaved among whom they lived and were often related, but they were obviously hard-pressed to come up with so much money. But they did. And when they did, the white Baptists upheld their part of the bargain. The Constitution of the church declared that the white minister, required by law, would be paid $500 per year, raised by what they call penny collections at every meeting. The white Baptist churches of the city agreed to make up any difference, but they never had to. The founders of the new church approached the young president of Richmond College to take on that role as well. He frankly admitted that he was tired of traveling to country churches many Sundays, which kept him away from home and the college more than he wished, and speaking at the new First African Baptist Church would be easier on his family. But he also said that he felt, quote, that he had no right to excuse himself from the duty of helping forward so important an object. He admitted later, 30 years later, that slavery had long been a burden to his mind. He did not believe that it was intrinsically a sin, but he did believe, quote, that some grievous sins were closely and constantly connected with it. The separation of husbands and wives, and parents and young children for mere gain, and the prohibition to teach colored children to read the Word of God except under very limited condition, regarded as glaring wrongs. And as we all know, all he needed to do was look down the hill from First African Baptist to see the largest domestic slave trade in the Upper South. All he needed to do was look over the hill to see every day husbands and wives, though they're not recognized by the state of Virginia as such, children separated from their families. He knew that this was a terrible sin connected with slavery. He said that he'd always seen in slavery, quote, the mysterious hand of God leading the Africans to Jesus. And he did not understand how, quote, that Negroes, without exception, should be forbidden to preach, however qualified and sanctioned by their respective churches. He said, if you can't trust the churches, who could you trust? And to not allow any black men, as it would have been, the right to minister to their fellow African Americans, he thought was just wrong. He says, this seemed not only to violate freedom of conscience in regard both to the whites and the blacks, but to attempt to contravene the manifest purpose of God in permitting slavery. Because the most common argument that you heard about why slavery was right and just is that if God did not want it, why did it exist? If God did not mean for the slave trade to bring Africans to America where they could be introduced to the words of Jesus Christ, then why did it exist? But Robert Ryland says, if we are also saying that they cannot preach to each other, aren't we contradicting ourselves? In common with all his thoughtful fellow citizens, he said, he had long been oppressed with these reflections, but the whole subject was too delicate and embarrassing to admit of ventilation. Too delicate to admit of ventilation. The very heart of evangelical Christianity, of course, depends on the sinner choosing to acknowledge his or her sins and to seek forgiveness. But how could an enslaved person make that choice in such a constrained environment? So, in 1841, Ryland took on the work as the white pastor of the First African Baptist Church, despite, he said, the odium that would certainly be connected. This is not a popular thing among many people. And we look on it now and think, Christianity shared among white and black is a great thing. But we need to remember that a lot of people were not evangelical Christians in the antebellum South, and were skeptical of black people being given this autonomy in whatever form it came. The Constitution of the new church provided for 30 African American deacons who would be the ruling element of the church. Ryland recalled them as intelligent, godly, and highly respected body of men who wanted only their own spiritual culture, the salvation of their people, the peace and order of society, and the glory of God. They were elected by the congregation, and most of them were free blacks, but some were enslaved. The deacons served as the community's judges, patrons, and ambassadors. With a total annual budget that reached $3,000 in the late 1850s, the deacons were able to feed hundreds of the hungry, patronize free black businessmen for church-related services, and even help purchase at least 3 fortunate souls from slavery. The church, one of the largest buildings in Richmond, was also rented out to white groups for everything from political meetings to literary addresses. And they took an offering for the starving in Ireland in the 1850s. Ryland declared that he treated the deacons and the congregants and all his official intercourse exactly as I would a white congregation, i.e., with the greatest possible respect. If they were slaves, he said, I thought of them as Christ's freemen. If free, as Christ's slaves. In truth, brethren, the gospel knows no white, no black, no rich, no poor, no bond, no free, no north, no south, no east, no west. The gospel was devised for man, and man needs the gospel. This is 30 years later. At the time, he said, what was his purpose in the church? Quote, to preach out of their mind the dreams and fancies, their visions and revelations, and all their long-cherished superstitions, and to preach into their minds a knowledge of the great facts of the religion with its consequent doctrines, obligations, and privileges. You have to wonder, were those dreams and fancies perhaps of freedom, of earthly deliverance, of reunited families? Ryland wrote a catechism of 52 lessons for his black congregation with yes or no answers that reinforced the duty of slaves to obey their masters. But that same book, Mayor Mayo of Richmond charged, was an invitation and an aid to help slaves learn how to read. But Ryland persisted. He recognized that the congregation possessed powerful preachers among its numbers who could not by law be permitted to speak from the pulpit. But as a sort of compensation for this slight, he said, they and others were called on to pray several times at each religious service. Many of these prayers exhibited great fervency and power and afforded the highest degree of comfort both to those who offered them and to those who heard them. And when the vast congregation poured out its full soul in the old-fashioned songs, the long and loud burst of praise reminded one of the sound of many waters. He admitted he sometimes allowed those prayers to go on for a long time. Now, he didn't fool himself into thinking that his sermons were the reason that people came to First African Baptist Church. In fact, he quickly discovered that many of his congregants arrived only when their fellow African Americans began to speak. And so he admonished them, please come on time to hear what I have to say. And finally, he ordered the doors locked after the services began, and so they were forced to come. He tells a story on himself. You got to like a guy, a public speaker who would acknowledge. Matter of fact, if you don't mind closing those doors right now, I'd appreciate it. So by 1855, First Richmond African Baptists could boast 3,000 members. Those members disciplined one another and sought to maintain marriages among slaves and between slave and free that the state of Virginia denied existed. Few white people, including Ryland, paid close attention to the work of the African Americans in the church, creating a rare space for leadership and autonomy, if only by default. And the church spun off many daughter congregations, with Second Baptist having more than 2,000 members by 1860. But Ryland had serious struggles with duty and faith. Quote, the church had passed through some severe trials during its brief career, he admitted at the time. The severest trial turned around those who escaped slavery and used the church to help spread the word back home of how they could do it as well. So, back when the post office was not what it is today, in which addresses were fluid, African Americans who had been sold away from the church, or who had been moved away legally, or who had escaped Richmond, would send letters back to their family in care of the church. And Reverend Ryland would spread them out on the table and call the names. Not knowing the parties oftentimes and having no other method of distribution, he said, I announced them from the pulpit on Sunday at the close of worship, and the respective parties came up and received them. About this time, several enslaved people escaped from Richmond and wrote letters back home telling how their families could do the same. And the letters were somehow discovered. And Robert Ryland came under enormous attack. People said, this is what we told you would happen if we allowed the Negroes to have any kind of autonomy and freedom. And we blame this white preacher for willing to stand up there, oversee this church, and this is the sort of thing that could happen. Ryland was cleared, but the pastor, quote, was mortified to perceive that a few of the congregation had abused my confidence and had caused me unwilling to desecrate the pastoral office to purposes foreign to its design. It was certainly no part of my purpose, and should have been none in assuming that relation, to use my influence either secretly or publicly to disturb the legalized usages of society. I felt impelled by a sense of propriety to announce to the congregation I should not in the future deliver any letters from the North without a personal acquaintance with and full confidence in the recipients. The letters were suffered to remain in the post office, and I was relieved from unjust suspicions. But that wasn't enough. Some of the white authorities said, you know, Reverend, what you should do is to ensnare runaways. You should take the letters and give them to us, and we'll open them and find out who's trying to entice our colored people away. Ryland said, no. Here was a total misconception of the spirit and genius of the pastoral office. I had not the least intention, should have had none, when I became a pastor of the colored people, to degrade my office to a police to detect and to apprehend runaways. Let them who are appointed to this work and who have a taste for it engage in it. Be it mine to preach the gospel, to watch for souls, to make a full proof of my ministry. To have aided servants to flee from their masters, or masters to detect their fugitive slaves, would have been equally aside from my duty, and equally destructive of all my capacity to do good. This whole occurrence was fraught with danger to the church. It raised up a host of suspicions against us and taught us a lesson of caution. He was never able to relax this sense of caution. Now, the fact to our ears that he's equally mortified by both sides of this seems wrong. He's mortified to learn that he would aid people to escape perpetual bondage and to be interfering with perpetual bondage. And this helps account for this blistering charge by the famous Richmonder Henry Box Brown, who, after watching his family sold and marched in front of him in chains, had himself shipped to Allies and Freedom in Philadelphia. If you've never seen the memorial down on the Canal Walk and tried to imagine getting to that big brass box, it's not that big. I encourage you to do that. It's down there near Bottoms Up Pizza. Think about how desperate you'd have to be, and how desperate you'd be if you'd seen your wife and children. As Brown worked on behalf of abolition to audiences throughout the North and England, he leveled charges at Robert Ryland. You'll recognize some of the same things he said about the church, but from a very different angle. The Reverend R. Ryland who preached for the colored people, was professor at the Baptist Seminary near the city of Richmond, and the colored people had to pay him a salary of $700 per annum, although they neither chose him nor had the least control over him. He did not consider himself bound to preach regularly, but only when he was not otherwise engaged. So he preached about 40 sermons a year and was a zealous supporter of the slaveholders' cause. And so far as I could judge, he had no notion whatever of the pure religion of Jesus Christ. He used to preach from such texts as that to the epistle to the Ephesians, where St. Paul says, "Servants, be obedient to them that are your masters and mistresses according to the flesh, and submit to them with fear and trembling." He was not ashamed to invoke the authority of heaven in support of the slave-degrading laws under which masters could with impunity abuse their fellow creatures. This is the same man. They describe the same institutional arrangements, but one was free and one had been enslaved. One was white, the other was black. One delivered the sermons and the other heard them. One had his family in Richmond and the other had no idea where his family was. Here's how the Methodist Richmond Christian put it with remarkable clarity. Which party most strictly conforms to the doctrines and practice of Christ and the apostles? Those who seek to save the souls of the slave population of the country, or those who strive merely for their freedom? That's how the white Christian South talk to themselves, that we are the true friends of the enslaved people, and those who want merely to free them are the pretended friends. Now, the churches were something of a trap for black Virginians. If they did join the church, they submitted to some form of white religious oversight. The most precious thing perhaps in their lives could have been compromised by the sermons they were forced to hear over and over across the South. Do not steal, obey your masters. And it seems that if they rejected this as pro-slavery propaganda, white Virginians said, "We told you." We offer them fellowship in our churches and they won't even come in. You tell me that they are not heathen, you benevolent Yankees. So if they join, they find a compromised form of Christianity. If they don't, it's used as an example of how they aren't taking advantage of the great bounty that white Southerners are holding before them. So First African Baptist flourished, but found itself at the center of the irreconcilable conflicts at the heart of a slave society based on Christianity. When war descended on Virginia and on Richmond in 1861, Ryland once again stepped to the fore. He appeared in the Richmond Dispatch several times throughout the Civil War years. At the war's outset, he urged Christians to visit the wounded and the ill soldiers who were pouring into the camps in our city, and to bring them religious books. Before long, Ryland spoke about a different subject in starkly different language. The long-cherished hatred of the northern states toward the institutions of the South, slavery, has at length developed itself in an aggressive and cruel war, a war which, in the inadequacy of its cause, in the earnest efforts of the assailed to avert it by peaceful adjustments, and in deliberate purpose to exterminate or subjugate brothers whose chief crime consists in asking to be left alone, has no parallel among civilized nations. The white South are the victims. They ask only to be left alone. In April 1865, black federal troops marched into Richmond and barred Ryland from preaching at First African Baptist. The members of the church voted to hear him preach one final time in the spring of 1865, and he offered his resignation, he recalled, from a belief that they would, quote, naturally and justly prefer a minister of their own color. The resignation was proposed and accepted with mutual kindness and goodwill. He knew that he was an imposition. He knew that he was an intrusion. He knew that at the first moment, black Christians would choose to hear from other black Christians. He lost everything he had in the war. In 1865, he had nothing left but $10 in gold and a good milk cow. and to support himself, he sold milk on the streets of Richmond. After emancipation, and the college lost everything. It invested its entire endowment in Confederate bonds, lost a fifth of its alumni, died in the Confederate Army. So after emancipation, Ryland stepped down as president of the devastated college, taught at a school for freed people in Richmond, based in Lumpkin's Jail, the only available space. But he left Richmond in 1868 for Kentucky, where he served as president of female schools in 3 different communities, and he died in 1899. It's something I ask all of us to remember. The Civil War seems like a long time ago. These folks aren't dying until the 20th century. It's not that long ago. Back in Richmond, in the meantime, dozens of members of the First African Baptist Church became ministers. Baptized a slave by Ryland in 1842 and ordained a deacon by him in 1856, James H. Holmes became pastor of the First African Baptist Church in 1867. He taught alongside Ryland in the school down in Shockoe Bottom. John Jasper, also baptized by Ryland in 1842, founded 6th Mount Zion Baptist Church in Jackson Ward and became probably the most famous man in this city in the decades after the Civil War. He had a famous sermon that people came from all around the country to see. Somebody actually knows it. Here in 2015, people still know the name of that sermon, The Sun Do Move. And people would come and say, here was a man born a slave, and now he's the person we come to hear wisdom. You look back on this, and Robert Ryland did baptize them because that was his responsibility as pastor of that church. But the African-American biographer, John Jasper, remembers the black church in a different way, as a home where black people themselves ministered to one another, nurtured one another, raised each other up in the spirit of Christianity. It gives you a good sense of how complicated all this is, that the same story can be remembered in such profoundly different ways. The bargain at the heart of First African Baptists became hard to imagine for either blacks or whites, the conditions of forced intimacy passing away. Few black Richmonders longed for a church with a white minister, and few white Richmonders cared much about what happened in the black churches. Long before official segregation settled over Richmond, over Virginia, over the South, a profound silence developed between black people and white people, even those with the bonds of faith to tie them together. Now here's what that's looked like from the viewpoint of the Presbyterian Church. Now black evangelicals began during the war the process of transforming themselves into independent churches and formed new African American congregations where there had not been any. By 1866, at least 2/3 of the African American men and women who had attended church with whites or under white supervision before the war worshiped in fully autonomous, all black congregations. I'll say that again, because this will be on the test, so be ready. By 1866, 2/3 of all African Americans already worshiped in all black congregations, which had not existed 5 years earlier. This tells you two things. One, the longing of the African American community, their connection to the Christian faith, to their eagerness to have their own churches at the very first moment. That process doesn't wait for the end of the Civil War. Even during the war itself, African Americans are creating their own churches. Now, they'd already had their own churches in many ways, out in the woods, in the fields, in the cabins, where they had asked to be delivered from slavery, where they had ministered to one another without a nice building, or without the sacraments, or without authorization from the state of Virginia. But they wanted churches. They wanted a church that you could point to. They wanted a church in which you could be married. They wanted a church in which you could be baptized. And that process begins the moment that it can. Just as the end of slavery begins the moment that it can. 3 weeks after Virginia secedes, the 3 black men go to Fort Monroe and say, "We're on your side." After 200 years, longer than we are from the Civil War, of slavery, That's how quickly the illusions unravel. How quickly white people, including Christians, have to recognize that the stories they've been telling themselves just weren't true. After the Civil War, rather than call attention to their charitable works on behalf of enslaved Virginians, White instead emphasized the evangelical of their former Confederate leaders. And one of the leaders of this effort was Robert Louis Dabney, a prominent Presbyterian pastor. He was offered the pastorship of the Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church in New York City and a professorship at Princeton in 1860. But instead, he stayed in his native Virginia, born in Louisa County, and became chief of staff to Stonewall Jackson, and later wrote an influential biography of Jackson. And Dabney helped create this image of the Confederacy and its leadership as a particularly Christian crusade. Now, after the war, Dabney lived here in Richmond, and he attended a synod here in November 1867. The Presbyterian Church in Virginia never had that many black members because black Christians preferred the Baptist Church in overwhelming numbers. But those who decided that they preferred the Presbyterians, and with some cost among their fellow African Americans perhaps, tended to stay with the church after the war a little bit more than the Baptists and Methodists did. And the question soon came up whether or not to ordain any of these African American men. And this is what precipitated Dabney's speech. He was responding to a resolution in the church that urged that the General Assembly be overtured to declare that the church is Christ's universal kingdom, that its doors are open alike to all those who love the Lord Jesus, and that ordination to the work of the gospel ministry is to be given to all those called of God to and qualified for the work without respect of persons. By persons, of course, they mean men, but from that, those are powerful words. And Robert Louis Dabney would have none of it. And I must tell you, his words are shocking and offensive even to somebody like me who reads this stuff all the time. But we're talking honestly tonight about what was said and the consequences. So this is 1867. Here are parts of his speech. I have had enough of declarations and manifestations of special interest in and love for the souls of the freedmen, he puts in quotation marks, when I see them almost universally banded to make themselves the eager tools of the remorseless enemies of my country, to assail my vital rights, and to threaten the very existence of civil society and the church at once. I must beg leave to think the time rather malapropos for demanding of me an expression of particular affection. I am utterly opposed to you. I oppose the entrusting of the destinies of our church to any degree whatever to black rulers, because that race is not trustworthy for such position. There may be a few exceptions. I do not believe I have ever seen one, though I have known Negroes whom I both respected and loved in their proper positions. Now, who that knows the Negro does not know that his is a subservient race, that he is made to follow and not to lead, and his temperament, idiosyncrasy, and social relation make him untrustworthy as a depository of power? Have they not done enough recently to teach us how thoroughly they are untrustworthy? They have, in a body, deserted their true friends and natural allies and native land to follow the beck of the most unmasked and unprincipled set of demagogues on earth to the most atrocious ends. They have just in a body deserted the churches of their fathers. So this is Dabney, 1867. After all we did for them, they're deserting the churches to have their own. For a generation, he continued, Southern Christians have seen the Negro made the pretext of a malignant and wicked assault upon their fair fame and their just rights. At length, he has been made the occasion of a frightful war, resulting in the conquest and ruin of the land and the overthrow of all our civil rights. And now our conquerors and oppressors, after committing the crime of murder against our noble old commonwealth and treading us down with the armed heel, are practicing to add every atrocious injury, the loathsome insult of placing the Negro's feet upon our necks. This day we are threatened with evils through Negro supremacy and spoliation, to whose atrocity the horrors of the late war were tender mercies. And these ebony pets of this romantic philanthropy this day lend themselves in compact body with an eager and almost universal willingness to be the tools of this abhorred project. The scorpion, say rather the reptile lash in the hands of our ruthless tyrants. So it's politics, he says. Not only did the Negroes desert us as soon as the Union Army became anywhere nearby, but now they are willing, here in 1867, this is 4 months after the Reconstruction Acts, in which black men are allowed to vote. He's furious that they had the audacity to turn upon those who took care of them for 200 years to vote with the Republicans who have destroyed our civil rights in our native Virginia. But our brethren, turning heart-sore and indignant from their secular affairs, where nothing met their eye but a melancholy ruin, polluted by the intrusion of this inferior and hostile race, looked to their beloved church for a little repose. There at least, said they, is one pure, peaceful spot, not yet reached by this pollution and tyranny. There at least Virginians may meet and act without the disgust of Negro politics and the stain of Negro domination. Will you dare to say to them, no? There too the hated subject and the foul intrusion shall be thrust upon you. But this is not all. Thoughtful men see in this pet of tyranny and oppression, to the edge to which the Negro and his allies now urge us, beneath the lowest depths, a lower, deep, still opening wide. It is a result which we well know the astute architects of our ruin clearly foresee and intend, and for the procuring of which they provide, when they implore the political equality of the Negro with a cunning inspired by their own master, the devil. They know mankind in its weakness and its baseness. They have measured accurately the degrading effects of subjugation, of poverty, of grinding oppression, of despair upon a people once chivalrous. The 19th century writes with lots of words, so I'll paraphrase briefly. The Yankees have a plot in mind here. This isn't just about the church. And believe me, this is nothing about Christianity, he's saying. This is a part of the Yankee effort to degrade us racially. Here's what I'm talking about. He must be innocent indeed, who does not see whither all this tends, as it is designed by our oppressors to terminate it. It is, shall I pronounce the abhorred word, amalgamation. Race mixing. This is all a plot, he says, by the Yankees to have mixing among whites and blacks. Yes, sir, he says, these tyrants know that if they can mix the race of Washington, Lee, and Jackson with this base herd which they brought from the pens of Africa, if they can taint the blood which hallowed the plains of Manassas with this sordid stream, the adulterous current will never again swell a Virginian's heart with a throb noble enough to make a despot tremble. But they will have for all time a race supple and groveling enough for all the purposes of oppression. You see what the plot is? That if they can get white and black Virginians to racially mix, to have children together, then the Yankees will be able to dominate the South forever. And he holds up the terrible example of what this will be like. I hope you're ready. Mexico, where it's a mongrel race, he says. And look what Mexico is like. The Yankees are trying to Mexicoize the South. And this is just an opening wedge. It may be well to attempt an answer to the national question. What alternative do you propose, Reverend Dabney? I reply that I would first kindly invite and advise the black people to remain as they are, as they were, members of our churches, and under our instruction and church government. I'm not opposed to worshiping with black people. I just insist that they worship under our guidance, under our ministers. For I'm well assured that this would prove best for their true interests. But if they will not be wise enough to agree to this, while I deplore their mistake, I would still attempt to do them all the good possible, which can be done without injustice to our church and by righteous means. Then, as a second alternative, I would assist and encourage them to build up a black Presbyterian church, ecclesiastically independent of and separate from ours, but in relations of friendship and charity. To this end, I would extend them ministerial and missionary labor liberally. I would aid them in church building. I would provide schools separate from our own for training black men to be pastors of black churches. And I would, if necessary, give ordination to enough men to form a separate presbytery, when enough can be found possessed of constitutional qualifications. But I would make no black man a member of a white session or presbytery or assembly, nor would I give them any share in the government of our own church, nor any representation in it. So you see already in 1867 the script that white Virginians, including white Christians, would follow for the next century. I wish these people no ill will. It's too bad that they are the puppets of the Yankees who only want to degrade us. All that we ask is that we remain firmly in charge of everything, even down to the religious faith, and that increasingly, over the next 50 years, Virginians would segregate every aspect of the society down to the Bibles on which people would swear in the courtroom. They would separate in the South, I don't know for sure this is Virginia, but in the South, they would segregate school books in the summertime. Here in Richmond, obviously segregating the streetcars, for which we proudly claim to have the first in the world, the electrics, then the buses, the schools, the parks. But the churches, with an autonomy that these products of the state don't have, had their own choices to make. And people on both sides, maybe because of the charged environment of shared Christian faith, felt that they needed to go their own ways. And here's a remarkable thing. The African American Christian population surges after the Civil War. Before the Civil War, there were perhaps 65,000 to 70,000 of the 550,000 African Americans of Virginia who were formal members of Virginia's evangelical churches. Many more attended regularly, so say 80,000. By 1890, of the 636,000 black men and women living in Virginia then, 239,000 were members of independent black churches. So within 25 years, you find the number triples, quadruples, when black people can go to their own churches with their own leadership, their own deacons, their own ministers. And as we all know, those churches became the very foundation of the African American community. They helped create a new black leadership class, which then led to the great moral revolution of the civil rights movement. This is interesting. This is not what the Reverend Dabney worries about. He sees black Christians as people without their own will, as merely as puppets and tools of the Yankees. Because he cannot imagine them exercising their own will, their own Christian faith, to read the Bible and understand that it talks about the brotherhood of all people. He cannot imagine that those churches that were being born all around him, that he was helping to create by refusing the true integration of the church. He could not have imagined that even then they were starting to lay the foundation for the ruin of the culture of segregation that was even then being built. So even as segregation is being created, the agents of its destruction are also being created. And those white Virginians who had feared the Christian church the Christian faith, under the leadership and guise of African Americans themselves, were right, because it ended up being the glue that bound together African American community, emerging through such hard times, so many decades of every kind of injustice that white Virginians could think to direct at them. Those churches, just as Reverend Dabney said, were an island, a place of refuge where the secular world could not intrude. And in those churches, and one of the great ironies of Southern and American history, African Americans found within themselves the power to dare resist this enormously powerful and threatening and dangerous and fiercely invoked culture of segregation and law of segregation. The ironies of this are endless. And I'm grateful for this church and to its partners who are using this opportunity of the sesquicentennial of the end of slavery to think hard about how we are best to go forward. I would like to end by asking us all to reflect on the differences between what the Reverend Dabney said and the language that is on the home page of this very church. We are a vibrant Christian community where all are welcome, follow Jesus Christ, respect one another, and are strengthened and inspired through worship, study, prayer, and service. And your fellow church at Second Presbyterian announces, we welcome all whom God calls into life, worship, work, and leadership of this church. And leadership of this church without regard to gender, cultural heritage, skin color, socioeconomic status, or sexual orientation. It may very well be, and I believe it is, that as the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King told us, the long moral arc of the universe does bend toward justice. Thanks very much. Let's hear what you'd like to talk about. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. That's all we have time for. Goodbye, everybody.
Wait a minute, 1 minute. Let me pretend, as the first question asker, that I'm Tim Russer. I'm Tim Russer.
Yes?
From Meet the Press.
I don't like where this is heading.
And I have here a quote I'm throwing up on the screen from your own book,
Yeah?
The Promise of the New South, and a chapter on faith. I'd like to have your comment on this quote. It says, John Briggs, after receiving his Master of Theology degree, returned to his pastorate in Greensboro in Georgia's Black Belt. He wished to build a new parsonage, but had to turn to his family back in North Carolina for money, because, as he explained in confused if revealing syntax, all the wealthy members are dead and have moved to Atlanta.
So all the wealthy members are dead and have moved to Atlanta, is what Randy was reading. And yeah, the people who visited the South after the Civil War said they had never seen such a churched place in all their life, that they had never seen a more thoroughly saturated Christian culture among black and white than the South. And those of you who maybe are not from here originally, not so much Presbyterians, but other evangelical Christians, are pretty forward in asking if you're a Christian, and would like to talk to you about that pretty quickly. I think people from elsewhere are sometimes shocked by that. And the South after the Civil War, in different ways, read the Bible and saw themselves in it. African Americans, of course, saw themselves as the children of Israel, that they had been in slavery, and that surely God had a special mission for them to try them so, and found their faith not shaken but deepened by that belief. The white South felt that they too had been put through the trials and tribulations, but of defeat in the Civil War, and that they too were being tested to see what kind of people they were. So if you look at this is kind of a long riff on this one quote. I can't do too much more with people being dead and gone to Atlanta, so I'll talk a little bit longer. But I'll be talking about the South. What happens afterwards is that the churches fragment. There's churches all over the place. And the Baptists especially don't have the same kind of structure that you folks do. Proliferate. And people worried, what this reflects is that, are there too many churches? You know, because people are moving to town, and it seems that every time there's a schism in a congregation, they create a new church. And so, if you would have visited the South in the late 19th century, in the wake of all this, you would have seen black and white churches growing very rapidly. And the white South would say, we are still the most, and black South too, we're the most Christian part of the nation. And that's why they took the lead in prohibition. But it's also why they were so resistant to other kinds of reforms like women's suffrage and other reforms like that. So the Christianity continues to burgeon after the end of slavery and after the defeat of the war.
Who has a question? I know we didn't get all that.
On your right there, Randy. Now we got two.
I've heard that 20% of the South were slave owners. How did they get the other 80% to fight to maintain that, to walk into bayonets and canister?
That's a great question. So the question was, only 20-25% of Southern white families would have claimed to have owned enslaved people. How'd the other 3/4 decide to sign up for the Confederacy? Well, I try to find quick ways to do this. One saying that I have is that white Southerners didn't fight for slavery, they fought for a nation based on slavery. Right? So it's not as if, first of all, 85% of all white Southern men of military age fight. It's not like that Jimmy Stewart movie where he's got all those strapping young men in the Shenandoah Valley who just said, no thanks. You had no choice but to fight. Okay, so that's the bottom line. You really had no choice. Okay? But many did have the choice early in the war, and they did. Because, and here's to think about this. Here in this city, they send delegates from all Virginia counties, back when we had West Virginia as a part of us, to figure out what Virginia should do in the moment of secession. So South Carolina secedes in December. It's now April, and Virginia won't do anything. And the South Carolina delegates write back and say, Virginia will not move until she is forced. Because Virginia says, we're the mother of presidents. We're the mother of the Constitution, of the Declaration of Independence. It's true, we are the largest slave state, but we also just put up this monument to George Washington. We love the United States. And so the delegates who were sent here voted overwhelmingly, repeatedly, not to leave the United States. They thought it would be their job to hold the country together. After Lincoln calls for troops, after Fort Sumter, they do secede. And only 1,000 white men in present-day Virginia fought for the United States. So in January, they send delegates here to keep us in the Union. By 1861, all white men have decided to fight. And how do they frame it? They say, I'm fighting for my home. I'm fighting for Virginia. I'm fighting for this new Confederacy. I'm fighting for Bobby Lee. They don't say, I'm fighting for slavery. But the Constitution of the new Confederate States of America only makes a very few changes. The most important are that they embrace slavery as an integral part of what this new nation will be. And one of the things that they say when they're creating it is that we are getting ready to create the most Christian nation on the face of the earth. Okay? So there's every reason for white Southerners who don't own slaves, all the way from coercion to belief that they are fighting for the most noble of causes. So it's caused lots of different ways, and even if you didn't want to, chances are you would. Good question. That's one of the most important questions. Have another question up front. Thank you.
My question is about religious freedom. You mentioned that free African Americans were forbidden by law to create their own churches. And I
Well, because free black people in the South were not treated as citizens, that they couldn't vote. They were actually, and the only ones who were here were legacies of earlier periods of manumission or of self-purchase. The law in Virginia says if you become free in the 1850s, you're supposed to leave. So because they could see how problematic just the kind of question you're raising was. What do we do with people who look like the enslaved people but are as free and maybe more skilled and maybe more Christian than many of us? So it's a problem. It's a problem. And so they wouldn't recognize freedom of religion. They also don't have freedom of congregation on the streets. They don't really have any of the things in the Bill of Rights because they're not citizens. What else we got? Over on your far right, I'll get you. I got you. I see you over there too. So, okay. Hi.
Hi. What were the religious, the spiritual practices of the first slaves, and when did this transition to Christianity take place? And I was going to ask if the religious practices of slaves ever became part of the dialogue about the First Amendment. But I guess you just answered that.
As well as I can. So the question was, what religious practices did people bring with them from Africa? And of course, they're coming from so many different cultures. The idea of Africans didn't exist among themselves. There was no sense that if they were selling somebody else with dark skin, they were somehow betraying their race, a concept which didn't exist. Race, as we think of it, is really a product of the very late 18th century. Thomas Jefferson was one of the first people to talk of it, of race being a biological fact. So the problem was when the first enslaved people are brought to Virginia, what happens when they become Christian? It becomes a problem before what happens about their skin color. What happens when an enslaved person embraces the same faith that you do? And the Christian faith has said it's okay, it's our mission to evangelize the world, but what if you do and then are they your equal? And Virginia decides no. And they, just as they decide that if a black woman and a white man have a child together, the child follows the status of the mother. And so Virginia doesn't have a law of slavery for most of the 17th century. It puts it together. It's borrowing laws, including the words Negro, from the Spanish, who had had slavery longer. They borrow some bits of the common law, and really over 40 or 50 years, they sort of assemble that. So, and remember, at the time, evangelicalism doesn't actually come to the South until the late 18th century as well. So for most of the time when most of the enslaved African population is coming here, certainly in the mid-18th century, the evangelical church, Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians, are just now beginning to arrive. So there's a very long time when it's the Anglican church, their colonies, and enslaved people are being brought from all over the western coast of Africa. There's a powerful memoir by a man named Ulada Equiano who writes what it was like to be brought to Virginia, which was at the very end of the world. I mean, it takes, if you end up in Virginia as an enslaved person, you've been passed over many times in the places you were most likely to go, which was Barbados and Bermuda, which are far larger slave societies than Virginia in the 17th century. And if you end up here, the odds of knowing anybody else or sharing their culture are even smaller. And he writes about, I stood in the field and there was no one who understood me. Okay? There was nobody else who spoke his language. So what you see is over 100 years, Africans being brought here, ripped apart, practicing their faith in secret, noticing similarities perhaps among different traditions, began to assemble a kind of a syncretic African-American religion, which then, and this, when I was talking about Ryland, who talks about everyone gets all those superstitions out of their minds, those superstitions are something that has endured maybe for 200 years of a belief that they held alongside Christianity, that they did not see as in tension with it. So this is something, I'm just paraphrasing like hundreds of books that have been written about all this, that we've argued about how much the traditions of Africa exist. I think the consensus is that a new kind of amalgam, a kind of a Pan-African practice and style of religion emerged. And so they puzzled over why was Christianity so appealing. And part of it was the culture of water would have been something they would have recognized. But you also think about some of the things we think of now as distinctly African American styles of Christian worship were probably African in their origins that were then grafted onto Christianity, right? So I think that what we want to understand is that these African patterns and cherished beliefs nourish and blend with, and this is where most of American music comes from too. It's the same thing. So it's not all of a piece, but somehow it infuses the new culture that they make for themselves. Kind of a long answer, so but Pete, you kept nodding, so I kept answering. Do you still have you still want to? Wait, I don't actually have. Randy, there's someone right there on the far side. Yeah, so the question was, as I understand it, that with the Industrial Revolution, it seemed like poor timing for slavery and for the Confederacy, right? Why is the capital of the Confederacy here? Well, one, it's the largest slave state. Two, it has shown what an industrial adaptation of slavery would look like. Virginia is what the future of slavery would have been had the Civil War not occurred when it did. Because you have enslaved people here making tobacco, but also working at Tredegar Iron Works, the most advanced technology available in the country at the time. And so that you would have found what Richmond is discovering, that unfortunately the Industrial Revolution and enforced labor could go together pretty conveniently. If you think about the Civil War not occurring, and you think about the labor, the economic changes that did occur, enslaved people would have been perfectly suited to building railroads, for lumbering, to working in tobacco factories. And so we'd like to think that progress in the form of industrialization would have scrubbed away slavery. Instead, you could have found the South, which was already the fourth richest economy in the world in 1860, and had a monopoly over the single most valuable commodity in the world, and whose enslaved population was worth more than railroads and banks and factories of the North combined. Let's imagine that as an independent nation, determining its own tariffs and trade partners. And let's imagine that doing what they said they wanted to do, which was to grow by taking Cuba. And let's imagine that slavery doesn't end in the United States in 1865. What would have happened in Cuba and Brazil, which followed after the emancipation of the African American population here? So I will end with this, if that's okay, Randy. Is that okay? If it's not okay, I can keep going. There's another question in the back, and so I will not quit. I'm sorry to tease people with this. But to answer your question, you could easily have had the Industrial Revolution and slavery going for another 50 years.
Now, I don't have a question from Buckingham County, Virginia. You probably tell I read it. But people between last Saturday in April, the Buckingham Historical Society has been doing a complete reenactment of Arbor Bush.
Oh, great.
It was done in 1829. It's a long story, which developed into a place called Alexander Baptist Church. And so basically that's also an announcement.
So give us the date and the time.
Good question.
Last Saturday in April.
Yeah, you can go online to Buckingham Historical Society to find more information. I'm not the best at that.
Great.
But the other thing too, we said Reverend Jasper, he was born in Buckingham.
And one of my great heroes, Carter G. Woodson.
25th.
April 25th is the date of that. And I've said Carter G. Woodson, one of my great heroes, was also born in Buckingham County.
This is true. This is very
So thanks very much. We have another question up front. Let the record show Ayers offered to set you free and that you insisted on doing that. This one. Yes, sir.
How did theologians at the time, Christian scholars at the time,
Yeah.
differentiate the black soul from the white soul?
Well, I'd announced at the outset I'm neither a theologian nor a philosopher. I would say with great difficulty if they did. The white church in the South declared that it was inappropriate to talk about politics in church. And that's one reason that these things that I read you were so shocking. You would not, before the Civil War, the church was the place, the refuge from that sordid world outside. And by that they meant things like those who would advocate for the end of slavery. They saw as the great disruptors of the wonderful fellowship that white and black Christians had. So I think that in most of their preaching, they would not have dwelt on the differences of black and white souls. They would have dealt on what Caesar rendered. And this is the world that we inhabit. And this is the world where the gift of Jesus Christ's mercy can be shared with everybody. Okay? So you have to grant that, right? And so they would not have talked very much about that, but they would have said, and even Dabney is saying, these are the secular situations that have ruined, in some ways, what should be the good communion among black and white Christians. As it turns out, you see, he's not blaming the white South, he's blaming the Yankees, basically, for ruining black people. And that was a convenient story that white Southerners would have for the next 100 years. So, but some would do that, but the great theologians of the antebellum South, Thornwell, often were Presbyterian, and they would wrestle with this. And instead, they would focus not on that, but on why it was that it had been God's will that slavery existed in the New World, and that the purpose must have been to evangelize the slaves. And then from there, the world. They would have seen this as radiating out. And so they had a special responsibility, is how they would have seen it. They would have seen it as a kind of a burden that God had seen fit to give to the white South to Christianize the slave population and then perhaps Christianize Africa as well. Yes?
Where would the country be as like if we had never had I think my point is that not to justify
No, of course not.
slavery, but we actually benefited from the economy that slavery brought to the South, to the whole world. Someone told me that in today's dollars, the value of slaves in 1860, $11 trillion.
That's about right. We live in a very different America. I think that, you could imagine all of America being Vermont or something, right? You'd find a lot of you're exactly right. A lot of the biggest fortunes, and not just in the South, are based on slavery. A lot of the leading educational institutions, including the Ivy League, are based on the slave trade and the profits from slavery. And New York City almost seceded from New York State because such a large proportion of its economy came from trade with the South. And so I think you point to an important factor.
One more question.
So I will stop. Yes?
The Jewish community in the South, merchants, there were a lot of merchants, was the original Lehman Brothers, cotton growers from Montgomery, Alabama. What was their position on slavery, if there was any single position?
I'm glad you brought that up, because if you've not seen the play The Whipping Man, which is currently playing here, which is about a Jewish Confederate and 2 Jewish slaves, I'd encourage you to do so. I did write the program text, for which I received nothing, so I'm not encouraging you to do that. Jews in the South were not leading in slavery in any way, and were not especially prominent in the slave trade. But say here in Richmond, something else that people need to go to is the show about the slave trade in the Library of Virginia. Someday during lunch, if you're downtown, or actually, even if you're not, go downtown and see this, an amazing, and there's the most powerful painting of the domestic slave trade ever painted is of our city, 1850s, and it's called Slaves Waiting for Sale. And it's 4 women and a baby and one very sullen man who are painted. The painting came out in 1861 in London, but it was painted from eyewitness here in Richmond. And you'll look at the painting and you'll say, wow, this doesn't look like Roots or 12 Years a Slave. Those people who are being sold are dressed up kind of nicely. They all have red scarves around their necks, and the man has a red vest. There was a business in Richmond. This one happened to be run by Jewish merchants that specialized in making clothes for people to be sold in. Okay? And so, if you lived in if you were a white Southerner, you could not remain immune from being entangled in slavery. All white people benefited from slavery. And Jewish Southerners, when the time came for secession, were as ambivalent about it as Christian Southerners, but ended up supporting the Confederacy as well. So there's not, and of course here in Richmond they would have seen Judah P. Benjamin walking the streets, a cabinet official in the Confederacy, and the Confederacy bragged. That shows you that we're not bigoted the way the Puritan Yankees are, that we will have a Jewish man as a member of our cabinet. So there's not really a very separate history of Jewish life in relation to slavery or to the Confederacy. So Randy announced that was the last question. He sits down. The microphone has been put away. So I just want to, not everybody would come out on a night and talk about these things. It's not fun. It's not, I do believe it's ultimately encouraging. I do believe that it suggests that we are making progress. I do believe the fact that we're willing to come together and talk about it is its own kind of progress. But not everybody will do it. And when everybody's willing to think about this, and when everybody's willing to recognize that we all have to work together to overcome this history that we've inherited, and you overcome it by confronting it, then I think there's really no limit to how great this city can be. You'd like to think that maybe we can be wiser from having to live with this, from having to see its remnants every day. That maybe we can be more humane. That maybe we can look in our own time and say, does this rhyme with our own experience in any way? Are there things that we're blind to that we explain away? And for that reason, I really appreciate you all coming out tonight. I hope to see you on April 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th. And I appreciate you having me with you tonight. Thank you.